November 1943. The Big Three are meeting for the first time. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. They have come to the Iranian capital, Tehran, to decide the future of the war in Europe. On the second day of the conference, Churchill presents Stalin with a sword inlaid with jewels. Its hand grip is bound in gold, its crossguard is solid silver, and on its blade are inscribed the words, "To the steel-hearted citizens of Stalingrad." Stalin passes the sword to Roosevelt, who holds it aloft and cries, "Truly they had hearts of steel." The Big Three appear united. But away from the cameras, tensions are growing. Secret frustrations, rivalries, and disagreements are threatening the relationship between these three men. And the rivalries are not only between the leaders. As Allied forces move from North Africa into the Mediterranean, two generals, Montgomery and Patton, have entered a very personal race to be the first to take Sicily and Italy. Will the first face-to-face meeting between the Big Three save this crucial wartime alliance, or pull it further apart? (1943) marked the turning of the tide in the Second World War. The months leading up to the Tehran Conference saw setback after setback for Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. In the Atlantic, the German submarine offensive against British and American shipping was faltering. Advances in Allied technology and an aggressive hunting strategy began to inflict heavy losses on the German U-boat fleets. In North Africa, German and Italian resistance crumbled. Hundreds of thousands of Axis troops surrendered to General Montgomery and the British Eighth Army. But the fiercest fighting was in the east. The brutal 5-month battle for Stalingrad had finally come to an end in February 1943, and the Russians had emerged victorious. Germany's Sixth Army had been wiped out, and the Axis powers had suffered almost 1 million casualties.
Through the efforts of the people of Stalingrad, but also the 62nd Red Army, through street fighting, which was kind of at close quarters, the Red Army and the citizens of Stalingrad managed to push back the Germans. This is important because of the psychological victory it provided, and the momentum after Stalingrad really turned towards the Soviet side.
German morale had been severely dented. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility had been smashed, and Hitler was determined to strike back. Plans were drawn up for a new offensive on the Eastern Front at Kursk, 280 miles southwest of Moscow.
Operation Citadel was the German attempt to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front after the disasters of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-1943. So it was designed to be a major battle that would suck in and destroy a large part of the Soviet army.
Leading the attack would be the Nazis' latest innovation in tank warfare, the Panzer Mark V. Known as the Panther, it was hoped that it would counter the fearsome Soviet T-34. It was the Wehrmacht's best hope of finally defeating the Red Army. The Panthers would lead the Nazis' new offensive on the Kursk salient, a 160-mile-long bulge in the Russian front line. Their attacks would come from the north and south, a pincer movement to cut off and destroy the trapped Soviet troops. But this time, Joseph Stalin was prepared. Intelligence had quickly revealed there was a troop buildup on the Soviet border. The Red Army was no longer the disorganized rabble it had been 2 years earlier, and they had weeks to prepare for the German assault.
They were very much a different army to what it was on the Barbarossa invasion. Open country, huge numbers of tanks on both sides. The Wehrmacht is outmaneuvered and outgunned by the Red Army.
The Russians built a series of defensive lines almost 25 miles deep. The ground was mined and crisscrossed with anti-tank ditches. Gun emplacements had been dug into the earth, and more than 3,000 tanks and around 1.3 million soldiers stood ready to repel the German attack. On the 5th of July, 1943, after a barrage of artillery fire, hundreds of German panzer tanks rumbled towards the Soviet lines.
The Battle of Kursk was simply the largest tank battle in history. There were 6,000 tanks, there was 5,000 aircraft. Like Stalingrad, this involved an immense number of troops. There were 2 million fighting in this battle. It was really Hitler's last roll of the dice.
The Germans inflicted heavy losses on the Red Army, but still they could not break through the massed Soviet defenses.
The Battle of Kursk was probably definitive in the way the Russian front was going to end, which was in Nazi withdrawal. And Kursk arguably puts the end to any hope on the Nazi side of regaining the initiative.
Ended up being a strategic defeat for the Germans, and again re-emphasized the fact that the next stop, well, maybe not the next stop, but the end of the line anyway, lay in Berlin, not in Moscow.
As the Battle of Kursk ground to a halt, more than 1,000 miles away, another military offensive was underway. Following their victory in North Africa, the Allies wanted to continue their success and fight their way into Europe through the Mediterranean, what Churchill called the soft underbelly of the Nazi beast. Their first target was Italy, and their access point, the island of Sicily.
Well, Sicily has importance of itself, a large island in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was the naval motorway from Britain through to Egypt and of course beyond. You wouldn't really think of invading Italy whilst leaving Sicily behind you in the hands of your enemy. Sicily was a stepping stone towards Allied operations in Italy.
3 months before the invasion in April 1943, German agents recovered the body of a British Royal Marine pilot from the waters off a Spanish beach. Documents handcuffed to the officer's wrist led Hitler's forces to believe that the Allied attack on Italy would come via Greece and Sardinia. Nazi troops were moved to those places to defend the German positions. But the documents were an elaborate hoax by British intelligence, codenamed Operation Mincemeat.
The Germans knew that there was going to be some kind of Allied attack somewhere in the Mediterranean. They didn't know where it was, and so the British dressed up a dead body, dumped it in the sea off Spain with supposedly the plans for an invasion to distract the Germans.
The Italian island was garrisoned by around 300,000 Axis troops, and they were caught off guard. On July the 10th, 1943, Allied paratroopers attacked from the air, while landing crafts stormed the beaches. Operation Husky had begun. It was an immense undertaking, involving 150,000 troops, 3,000 ships, and 4,000 aircraft. The German commander, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, soon realized the best he could do was delay the Allied invaders while preparing a retreat to the mainland. Meanwhile, the American and British forces embarked on their own private race. As the US 7th Army under General Patton advanced up to the north of the island, the British 8th Army under General Montgomery took control of the east. Both generals were highly respected, brilliant leaders, But they were at odds with each other. And after Montgomery had led the Allies to success in North Africa, Patton was determined to drive the United States to victory in Sicily and be recognized as the greatest general of the war.
If Montgomery was the preeminent, or one of the preeminent soldiers of the Second World War, Patton, I think you'd have to put down as one of the preeminent warriors of all time. You know, this is a fighting man who loves fighting, who operates at a level of instinct, whereas I think Montgomery is a much more rational general. The strength of that is that it means you do have a bit more scope for these flashes of insight that can prove very productive. And, you know, Patton was lucky as well as good in the sense that he had a good tool for executing these flashes of insight. The weakness, of course, is that it can mean you are either, well, wrong or reckless. And I think you see both of those traits in Patton's career as well.
As thousands of Axis troops escaped across the water to Italy, the invasion of Sicily became a race between the American and British generals. Both wanted their troops to be the first into Messina, the vital port on the northeast tip of Sicily.
Patton did not play the game the way that Montgomery expected it to be played. In Montgomery's mind, the British were going to drive up the east side of Sicily with the Americans on their left, across the middle of the island. And Patton, at a pretty early stage, realized this was going to be quite a difficult thing to do, and therefore it might be better to race all the way around the edges of Sicily instead.
Advancing up the east coast, Montgomery's troops were slowed temporarily by the Germans as Kesselring used the island's mountainous terrain to his advantage. This was a chance for the American general to get ahead. And to Montgomery's dismay, it was Patton's troops that entered Messina on the 17th of August, 1943.
The Allied invasion of Sicily was relatively quick and successful. It was a clear marker that Allies were engaged in Europe, that they were winning, and that ultimately they could succeed and gain a victory against the Axis powers.
What it did do was demonstrate, number one, that the Allies were going to make sure that they re-established control of the Mediterranean. Number two, that they were going to come on fighting the Axis on their home soil. And number three, it was instrumental in deciding the Italians to drop out of the war and to change sides in September of 1943. The loss of Sicily made it clear that the mainland of Italy was next. The Italians tried to avoid that fate by leaving the Axis and surrendering to the Allies.
The triumphs of 1943 at Stalingrad, North Africa, Sicily and Kursk brought the Allies in sight of total victory over Nazi Germany. But behind the scenes, not only was there division between the generals, there was also division between the big three. They did not agree over the best route to victory, nor over what would happen to Europe once victory had been achieved. While British and American troops fought in Sicily, gaining ground from the Axis forces, on the 24th of July, 1943, Benito Mussolini was voted out of office by his own Grand Council. Mussolini, known as Il Duce, had ruled the council since 1922. But as Allied armies entered the Italian mainland, the leaders in Rome saw that defeat was imminent. And the king, Vittorio Emanuele III, ordered Mussolini's arrest and imprisonment. In September, while German and Allied troops battled viciously on her soil, Italy surrendered. Despite the successes of the Italian campaign, there remained tensions between Churchill and Roosevelt. Winston Churchill knew early on in the war that American support was vital for an Allied victory. He'd exchanged hundreds of letters and cables with Roosevelt, as well as meeting him in North American waters in 1941. The blunt, emotional Churchill and the cool, charming Roosevelt had become friends. There was, however, a major difference between them. Churchill wanted to preserve the old ways and retain the British Empire. But Roosevelt wasn't going to destroy the Nazi Empire and Imperial Japan only for Britain to retain sovereignty over her imperial dominions. For the idealistic president, this war was a fight for liberty and self-determination for nations across the globe.
So much of the war aims, as articulated in several of their discussions, involved thinking of, liberating Europe from, if you like, the Nazi fascist empire. But then, of course, the ramification of that would mean potentially, especially in Roosevelt's understanding, that would also mean self-determination for the British Empire as well.
Increasingly, what happens is they start imagining what the world is going to look like after the war. And the problem is that each man had a unique vision for what the world would look like after the war. And so the tie that bound them in this sort of alliance starts to fray quite significantly.
And it was already clear that Britain would not be the dominant power. Roosevelt commissioned one of his closest aides, Harry Hopkins, to report on the possible future relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. He concluded that Russia's post-war position in Europe will be a dominant one, and every effort must be made to obtain her friendship.
Well, Roosevelt quickly recognized that Stalin was going to be a major player, not only in the war, but in the post-war era, and he set out to develop good relations with Stalin. He believed that he was more capable of doing so than Churchill, because Churchill had a record of anti-communism dating back to the 1920s.
Secretly, Roosevelt sought a private meeting with Stalin in Alaska, to which Churchill was not invited. The purpose was to pave the way for a post-war US-Soviet relationship. At first, Stalin seemed open to the idea, but then doubts set in. Stalin was determined to exact a high price for his post-war cooperation. Since 1942, he'd been calling for a second front in Europe. Soviet soldiers and civilians were dying in their thousands. Stalin needed a diversion to draw German troops away from the east. But his allies had pushed back again and again. Churchill, in particular, had insisted that they were not yet ready to invade occupied France.
Stalin remained very, very concerned that the Western Allies were deliberately letting the Soviet Union do most of the fighting, bleeding it dry and therefore weakening it for the post-war situation.
When the Western Allies again delayed the invasion of France in May 1943, Stalin used it as an excuse to cancel the meeting with Roosevelt in Alaska. Even without Stalin's naturally suspicious nature, running a war separated by thousands of miles was far from ideal. Coordinating operations over such vast distances was difficult. Communications were slow and in danger of interception by the enemy. It was time that the three leaders met face to face.
Roosevelt himself, of course, was not particularly mobile because of his disabilities, though he was prepared to fly, which was very brave of him. Churchill, on the other hand, of course, had already covered a lot of miles, and during the course of the war covers about 100,000 miles travelling. So he is willing to travel and actually sees a big advantage in being the man who travels, because he can join the big three up. So he wasn't necessarily that anxious for a big three meeting, because he quite liked being the only one who connected the three of them together, because it enabled him to set the agenda, to manage the relationship in ways that actually meant that British lack of power was balanced by his willingness to put himself about.
But Roosevelt continued to push for face-to-face talks between all three of them, while Stalin kept putting him off. Baghdad was suggested, then Basra. Stalin turned them both down.
Stalin hated flying and also hated getting out of it anywhere he could not be absolutely assured of his security. So the kind of places that they could actually meet were distinctly limited.
He would always use the excuse, some people would say, justification, others would say, and the commander-in-chief of the Soviet armies were engaged in heavy fighting with the Germans. I cannot be too far from the front.
Stalin could not put off the meeting forever. When the Iranian capital Tehran was suggested, he finally agreed. Iran was under joint British-Soviet occupation, so there were already Russian troops there. And Tehran was only around 1,500 miles from Moscow, and Stalin could travel most of the way by train. The conference was codenamed Eureka, and the date was set for late November 1943. For the first time, the Big Three would meet one another in person.
The mood was one of optimism. They believed the corner had been turned, the successful defense of Stalingrad had really turned the tide, and they now believed it was a matter of time before the Germans would be defeated.
Before meeting the Soviet dictator, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to stop in Cairo. There, they would hold their own conference with their ally in the fight against Japan in the Pacific, the Chinese nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek.
At this point, Roosevelt envisages Chiang as one of what he called the four policemen, that the world after the war would be essentially managed by the four great powers, and he very much hoped that the Asian great power would be China.
Stalin had refused to attend the Cairo conference. Always concerned about his personal safety, he felt Cairo was too far to travel. Meeting Chiang Kai-shek could also put in jeopardy the Soviets' neutrality pact with Japan, China's sworn enemy.
Stalin placed a lot of importance on the neutrality pact with the Japanese because a long-time preoccupation of his had been to avoid fighting a war on two fronts. So he knew the Soviet Union could not fight the Germans on the one hand and the Japanese on the other. And so this meant that it was absolutely essential that that pact with Japan was stable because it allowed him to turn his forces to the Eastern Front really at their full capacity.
So Churchill and Roosevelt met Chiang without him. Officially on the agenda was the course of the war, and indeed, the fate of Japan. The talks would result in the Cairo Declaration, outlining a vision of a post-war Pacific. Japan would lose all the territory it had seized since 1914. Land taken from China was to be returned, and Korea would be independent. But the talks in Cairo went beyond the Pacific, and splits between Churchill and Roosevelt soon surfaced.
Churchill's made a lot of assumptions about Roosevelt's friendship and his commitment to Britain, and he's tended to gloss that into a commitment to the British Empire, because Churchill sees the two things as the same. Roosevelt doesn't. Roosevelt distinguishes very clearly between the British Empire, particularly the British Empire in Asia, and Britain itself. Churchill is, for the first time, I think, aware of Roosevelt's attitude towards the British Empire, and it worries him.
Both men were exasperated by the slow pace of the talks and the constant need for translation. Churchill had wanted to agree a British-American strategy before meeting Stalin, but this had not happened. The two leaders would instead carry their frustrations with them to Tehran. And if anyone could take advantage of this crack in the special relationship, it was Joseph Stalin. It was Winston Churchill's 69th birthday, and on the last day of the Tehran Conference, he was throwing a party at the British Embassy in Tehran. Roosevelt and Stalin were among the guests. The conference was the first time the Big Three had met face to face, and despite public displays of unity, the leaders had argued during the talks. It was a clash of egos and ideas that threatened to undermine the alliance. Churchill's birthday dinner was the last chance to put aside the rancor and division, ready for the final assault on Nazi Germany.
All three of them are very conscious that if they're going to succeed in securing victory against Nazi Germany and its allies in Europe, they're going to have to continue working together because Germany has a good position in the center of Europe, and they're going to need to continue coordinating their activities.
The Tehran Conference had started 2 days earlier. Stalin made sure he was the first to arrive. He had no intention of letting Churchill and Roosevelt gang up on him.
From Stalin's personal point of view, He wanted the same prestige within the big three. He wanted to be treated as an equal within that trio, and he felt that Roosevelt and Churchill were not taking him seriously in that respect.
When Churchill and Roosevelt arrived, they were presented with shocking information from Soviet intelligence. Agents had uncovered a plot to assassinate the Big Three while they were in Tehran. German commandos were allegedly in the city and preparing for the opportunity to strike. The story has become legend in Russia, the subject of books and films, but Western historians are more skeptical about whether the Germans' Operation Long Jump ever existed. There was a possible security risk in Tehran. While the British and Soviet embassies were side by side in a walled park in the center of the city, the American embassy was a mile away. Meeting up would mean potentially dangerous trips through the narrow city streets. Stalin, as always, had a solution. President Roosevelt could stay at the Soviet embassy instead. A suite of rooms stood ready. Despite the sudden discovery of the German threat, it even included a new disabled bathroom that could accommodate the ailing president's needs. Churchill quickly offered the British embassy as an alternative, but Roosevelt chose to stay with Stalin.
Roosevelt very gladly does so, even though his security people say, don't do that, they'll have bugs in your room. And Roosevelt says, good. I want them to hear what I have to say. Because he's a pretty cunning politician. He knows exactly what he's doing. You know, he's not met Stalin before. He's not going to miss the opportunity. And if it means treading all over Winnie, then he's perfectly happy to do so, because Roosevelt can be very ruthless.
Roosevelt's record was one of relative friendship to the Soviet Union. Two things Roosevelt wanted going into Tehran. One was to reassure Stalin that the Allies would launch an invasion of France in 1944 in order to cut off any possibility that an angry Stalin would negotiate a separate peace with Hitler, and B, to try to get Stalin to make a commitment to enter the war against Japan once Germany is defeated.
The British Prime Minister was unhappy and very aware that he was being made to feel the junior partner in this grand alliance. Britain had neither the manpower nor the industrial might to match the others.
Now, Churchill, who's staying in the British embassy, knows that these conversations are taking place, and he doesn't really like it. It gets in the way of his own personal relationship with the other two.
Churchill was having some time with the leaders that he was working with. Stalin at the time needed a lot of help. I think he was getting a little nervous.
The convivial Roosevelt was to chair the talks, but it was soon clear that it was Stalin who was taking charge. The discussions centered on one question: when would Britain and America open a second front in France to divert German attention from the East?
The Soviet records that we have suggest that he only had one issue that he wanted the Allies to discuss, and that was the Second Front.
They had effectively promised Stalin to invade in 1942 and 1943, and a third time delay would have been utterly unacceptable to the Soviets.
Yet Churchill still wanted to delay the invasion. He had been the politician in charge of the Royal Navy in the First World War, when his record was marred by the disaster of the Gallipoli campaign.
Churchill has this real sort of aversion to it because he's been there before.
Gallipoli, in the end, did not work at very considerable cost in blood and treasure. And I think Churchill was nervous that the amphibious invasion of France, and thereby Northwest Europe, might end in the same way, and therefore we must have everything as absolutely prepared as we possibly can before committing, and that takes time.
Churchill again argued that the Mediterranean should be the Allies' focus instead. Turkey should be brought into the war, and a new front opened in the Balkans to strike at Germany from the south.
Churchill was of the view that if the British plan was followed, it was a quicker way to get into Germany and thereby occupy Germany before the Soviet Union swept over the entirety of the country. The cause or the non-invasion of Western Europe in 1942 and 1943 was Winston Churchill's absolute insistence that the Allies weren't ready.
But this was not Churchill's only motive.
Some of this was to do with British imperial ambitions, you know, that they had an empire in Palestine and in Egypt that they wanted to consolidate and sort of get back up and running, if you like, and so clearing the Mediterranean was an important part of that.
Stalin had suspected Churchill of trying to undermine his advance into Central Europe and saw the whole strategy as an unnecessary diversion. In his view, the only true hammer blow would come from driving to the heart of the Third Reich through northern France.
The moment a Western front was opened in Normandy or wherever, that would draw German attention and they would be on two fronts. And that would relieve pressure on the Russian front. So that's why he was saying, come on, get a move on.
Stalin at one point then turns to Churchill and says to him point blank, do you believe in this operation? And Churchill has to puff on his cigar and say, yes, of course I do, provided certain conditions are met, which is obviously trying to find himself a way out.
The ill-tempered talks went on for days. There were insults and walkouts. In a message to his wife, Churchill described the meetings as grim and baffling.
President Roosevelt pushed Churchill pretty hard, I think, to start up a second front in France. And of course, Churchill was still saying, no, we can do this from the Eastern Mediterranean and create a kind of pincher movement.
The bottom line for the Americans was, we have to have an invasion in order to satisfy Stalin. Otherwise, the prospects of post-war cooperation are nil.
Churchill knew that Stalin and Roosevelt were meeting in the Soviet embassy without him. And when he requested one-on-one talks with the president, Roosevelt turned him down.
It's very clear to Churchill that he's on the outs and that Stalin and Roosevelt are getting closer and closer. And Churchill's starting to struggle to find a place, a reason to be there.
On the last day of the talks, Stalin finally got his way. It was agreed that battle would be joined on the Western Front in May 1944. British, American and Commonwealth troops would invade France with the greatest amphibious invasion force ever assembled. In return, Stalin agreed that Soviets would declare war on Japan. However, not until Germany was defeated. A formal agreement had been reached, but in trying to win over Stalin, Roosevelt had opened a rift with Churchill.
Roosevelt's sense of his relationship with Churchill, I think, is that by this point he's got Churchill in the bag. He doesn't need to soft-soap Churchill, but he does need to manage Stalin, and this is his opportunity.
On the last night of the conference, the leaders gathered for the Prime Minister's birthday banquet. The atmosphere was uneasy, and Stalin seemed uncomfortable in the opulent surroundings. But as the drinks flowed, the mood lightened. Roosevelt and Stalin presented Churchill with birthday gifts. And while Roosevelt retired early, Churchill and Stalin celebrated into the night. Stalin told the Prime Minister, "I'd like to be allowed to call you my good friend." Churchill declared, "I drink to the proletarian masses." Over cigars and champagne, the alliance appeared to have been mended. Late the following morning, talks were held on the future of post-war Europe before the summit formally closed. But as the three traveled home, their moods were very different. Stalin had got what he wanted from the conference, and Roosevelt believed his charm offensive with Stalin had worked, and the Soviet Union would be a peaceful post-war partner.
Roosevelt was thinking more and more about the post-war period and was determined to bring the war to an end in a way that would allow for the possibility of great power cooperation thereafter.
Churchill's mood, however, was bleak, because the agreement made at Tehran already hinted at the Cold War world that would lie beyond victory. A world dominated not by Britain, but by America and the Soviet Union. The Tehran Conference in 1943 committed Britain and America to the invasion of occupied France. By May 1944, Stalin was delighted. He had long pushed for this Western Front. Now, Churchill and Roosevelt had to deliver.
The Americans always believed that the war in the West would be won in France, not the Mediterranean.
Roosevelt finally got his guys out into Europe, getting what he wanted, to help out.
Churchill was fearful, partly because of the deep scars of the previous major amphibious landing he'd ordered at Gallipoli in the First World War.
That disaster haunted him from the rest of his life because it was his idea.
But was he now more confident of the chances of success?
By early 1944, I think he was fully on board with the decision to attack in Normandy and thought that there was a good chance that it would succeed.
The initial plans called for landings in the south and north of German-occupied France. But the Allies did not have the resources to mount two simultaneous attacks. So the southern option was postponed, and all hopes were pinned on the landings in the north. Operation Overlord. The landings would be dangerous. Germany had spent years building its Atlantic wall. From the south of France to Norway, the coast of occupied Europe bristled with coastal guns, bunkers, and fortifications. But the British had gathered intelligence about these defences.
There were a number of Polish prisoners who'd been conscripted into the German army, and they were captured, brought back to Britain, and basically they'd been involved in building Hitler's sea defences, and so they were eyewitness accounts. It had been years and years of careful intelligence, of cracking the codes at Bletchley Park, picking up information, interrogation of prisoners, double agents, all this kind of stuff going on behind the scenes, the spy stuff.
In February 1944, 4 months before the planned invasion of France, the Allies stepped up their bombing campaign on Germany. This was Big Week, a massive aerial assault lasting 5 days. Hundreds of American and British bombers rained fire on the German war machine. They hit airfields and aviation factories in Braunschweig and Gotha, Augsburg and Stuttgart, Regensburg and Schweinfurt. But that was just part of the plan. Allied commanders chose targets so important they knew the Luftwaffe would have to respond and take to the skies. There, the Allies planned to destroy them with a new weapon, the P-51 Mustang, a fast, long-range fighter plane. Despite losses of hundreds of planes and airmen, the Allies finally broke the back of the Luftwaffe. The Germans lost more than 250 aircraft, and their aircraft production was set back by 2 months. When D-Day finally came, the Allies would have control of the skies over Western Europe. But seaborne landings were among the most risky and complicated of military maneuvers. And the Allies already had experience of how they could go badly wrong. By the beginning of 1944, British and American forces had spent months fighting the Germans as they made their way up through Italy. At Monte Cassino in the Italian mountains south of Rome, the German 10th Army dug in using a bombed-out monastery for shelter. They resisted the Allied advance for months.
Monte Cassino sits high. The obvious route north is through quite a tight pass. Everything to the defenders' advantage, that terrain. And it became a bit of a slogging match.
It was Churchill who came up with a plan to break the deadlock. An amphibious landing at Anzio to draw away the German troops fighting in the mountains at Monte Cassino.
It's a stratagem whereby you bypass the front lines on land and go in behind your enemy by amphibious landing.
But the landing force was too small and too slow. By the time the Allied forces pushed inland, the Germans had rushed in reinforcements, and months of fighting followed.
It didn't go as smoothly as no doubt the planners had hoped, but it certainly, I think, did unlock what was a bit of a deadlock.
Monte Cassino falls in May 1944, and on the 5th of June, so the day before D-Day, the Allies liberate Rome. So there's clear progress on that front.
Mussolini's rule in Italy was effectively over. However, just days after being imprisoned, he escaped with the help of German commandos and set up a puppet regime until the final days of the war, when he was recaptured by Italian communist fighters. Victory in Italy had come at the cost of thousands of Allied troops, and the amphibious landings at Anzio had shown the dangers of getting it wrong. If the invasion of Normandy was to be a success, lessons would have to be learned. In Britain, in 1944, an armada was assembled. 2 million men and 9 million tons of supplies were to cross the Channel in the largest seaborne invasion ever attempted. But as D-Day approached, high winds and choppy seas threatened to delay the operation for weeks or even longer.
A number of meteorological factors had to be in harmony. The state of the moon, full, state of the tide, the sea state, etc. And there were only so many days in the month when these factors gave a window. And I think it was a 3-day window in June. Otherwise, you had to wait a month for the next full moon.
On the 6th of June, the weather settled enough to give the Allies the opportunity they needed. The Allied Commander-in-Chief, Dwight D. Eisenhower, gave the green light. Operation Overlord, the invasion of German-occupied Europe, was about to begin. Next time on Race to Victory, the landings in Normandy take Hitler by surprise.
Southern England crammed full of Allied troops in readiness for D-Day.
They set Patton up in Kent with a whole supposed army group. They had him driving around inspecting troops, pretending to be the first US Army group, which was going to bounce across the Channel and attack Calais and Boulogne. They had inflatable tanks and all this sort of stuff parked in fields so that any German aeroplanes could spot them and report back at this sort of immense concentration.
While the Big Three revel in the success of getting closer to Germany, cracks in their relationship appear. The reality of their differing post-war worlds is becoming apparent. And the Big Three still face multiple obstacles before they can win the war in Europe. How much longer will it be before the race to victory comes to an end?